So welcome to the virtual statewide pink meeting. I know Western New York, from what I've been hearing, is quickly approaching pink, and maybe even a couple of king blooms are starting to open up on some early varieties, as is certainly the case down in the Hudson Valley as well. While we're still sitting right about half-inch green to early type cluster on early varieties in the Champlain Valley. So we got a nice program for the next hour and a half. So I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to our first speaker. First, we're going to hear again this afternoon from Jessica Spaccio, who is with the Earth and Atmospheric Sciences Department at Cornell, giving us an update on where weather's going over the next couple of days and weeks. So Jessica, you're good to go.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Yep, I'm here just to kind of give you an update, a little bit closer to where things are going. And with that, we're going to start off. Here's a map that's issued by the National Weather Service. I do have the link at the bottom. These are one of the maps I look at first thing in the morning every day to see what's going on in the region. So for those of you down in Southeast New York, you can see we actually have some blues on the map where there's freeze warning and a frost advisory. So the dark blue is the freeze warning, and so that is for Orange County. So if there's any folks on the call from Orange County, you've got a freeze warning for overnight tonight with sub-freezing temperatures as low as 30 expected. So that'll be from tonight to early Tuesday morning. Other folks in the lighter blue there's just a frost advisory. So temperatures there are expected to fall into the mid-30s. So not as cold for those areas. This is a great map to look at kind of every day. To see what's going on, and the Weather Service is really good about putting out these advisories, watches, and warnings. Advance here. So to get a little bit, there's Monday, delve into this a little bit more, they also put out a graphical forecast of temperatures. For this, I just pulled minimum temperatures, thinking about frost risk. I didn't pull the maximum, but for the next several nights. So this is for tonight. So basically it covers a 24-hour period from 8 a.m. this morning to 8 a.m. Tuesday morning. So basically the low temperatures are going to occur over the night tonight, early morning Tuesday. So for ease, I'll say Monday night temperatures. So basically, if you look at the color bar at the top, you'll see kind of anything 40 or warmer is in those light blues, and then 30 to 40, kind of like a dark blue to the light blue. And then below 30 is where you start to see those purples. And then looking at the map, so in the Adirondack region, you see those purples up there. Western New York in the 40s overnight, they're looking pretty clear. But you see some blues kind of in there. They do put a few cities, they like, maybe that's Elmira or maybe more tights Binghamton, they've got a 30 listed there. And then, Southeast New York, where we have the warnings, we do see some dark blues there as well, where they're going to be closer to 30. So here's the forecast for Tuesday night. So that night's looking warmer, so things looking a little bit safer. Wednesday night, though, it looks like there's going to be a dip in the temperatures again, and I see a lot of 20s on the map. So I'm sure that's a concern for a lot of people. I will, with a little bit of warning, this map is put out by models, so doesn't have a whole lot of a forecaster's touch, so it just kind of gives you a glimpse, but I really prefer looking at the maps and then looking at, you can type in your address and look for the address that way as well. And obviously, if you know that you're in a cold valley and that you tend to be a little bit colder than, surrounding areas, then you'll be at greater risk than others. Thursday night, kind of a range a little bit warmer than Thursday, but we do see some temperatures, around 29, 30 there. And then Friday night, things look to warm up. Things look much better. And Saturday night as well, back into overnight in the 50s. And then we took a look farther ahead now, because there we were just looking at minimum temperatures for the frost risk. But the Climate Prediction Center puts out the longer term outlook looks, which I had shared the other week. So this is a 6 to 10 day forecast. So this takes us kind of from the end of that other period, April 27th. So from this Saturday to May 1st. This incorporates, that entire 6 to 10 days on lows and highs together, but they are favoring above normal temperatures with a 40 to 50% probability. So that's a pretty decent probability that we'll see some warm temperatures. If we look a little farther ahead, April 29th into May 5th, Most of the state is looking at a 50 to 60% probability of above normal temperatures. Part of Northeast New York up there at 40 to 50%, a little lower. But again, fairly good likelihood that we'll see above normal temperatures during that time period. Again, this is for, a time period. That doesn't mean that we'll have some, colder times, in between, but overall, there are probably a lot of growing degrees added over the next couple of weeks. The 3 to 4 day outlook, or excuse me, 3 to 4 week outlook was just updated on Friday on the 19th. So this is a pretty, a newer map, doesn't get as updated as frequently, but this one's from Friday. But what they're showing for New York is equal chances. So what does that mean? Well, basically they're saying, well, it could be equal chances up above, below, or near normal. So kind of a no call on anything for this period. But if we go back and look at, well, we go ahead really, but this is for the month of May as a whole. The Climate Prediction Center is forecasting above normal temperatures for May as a whole. 40 to 50 for most of the state, a little bit higher for Northeast New York, 50 to 60. So I'd be a little worried about a couple nights this week. Going forward, we look to be on the warm side. And I hope that helps you out a little bit in contact info and resources here. Thanks all.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Jessica. Are there any questions for Jessica? If you do, please go ahead and type those into the chat box, and we will get those answered for you. Not seeing any, I think we'll go ahead and have our next speaker on. The next person that we're going to hear from is Kenneth Beck, who is a graduate student in the Londo Lab, and he's going to be introducing a tree decline survey that he's currently working on. So, Ken, you are free to go.
Thanks so much. Okay, unfortunately, I had a couple of slides. I am not a host on the meeting, but that's totally fine.
If you give me a second, I think I should be able to give you that option. Just bear with me.
Yeah, well,
Sorry
I'll just
about that.
jump. No worries. I'll just jump right in and say that, yeah, I'm a second-year PhD student working with Dr. Jason Londo and hoping to find some good solutions for how to deal with apple decline. And one of the problems that we ran into when we were going to funding agencies, trying to get money to help run these experiments, is that there's very little data given the sort of how widespread apple decline is, how many growers are dealing with it, what the percentages of trees in affected blocks are. There's just none of that. So what we wanted to do is put together a survey that we're going to try to get as many folks in the state of New York to respond to as possible, where just really basic questions about whether or not you're experiencing decline, what sort of rootstock scion combinations you're seeing, what sort of climatic conditions might have led up in the last few years to you maybe seeing decline. So if you all are comfortable, I'm just going to drop a QR code here that you can scan to get to this Google sheet. It should take you about, if you're not experiencing decline, it should take about 30 seconds to get through. If you are seeing some decline in your orchard, it will probably take about 90 seconds to 2 minutes. This is really helpful data, like I said, that will allow us to go to funding agencies and say, listen, this is something that New York growers care about. It's something that's affecting their economic bottom line, and it's worth sending money our way to address this problem. And if you don't want to do it on your phone either, I can also drop this link in the chat that will take you to the same site. So that's really all I've got. I appreciate the time and let me come here and speak.
All right. Thank you very much, Ken. Certainly a continuing issue that we're seeing around the state. So I appreciate you taking a lead on this and putting the survey together for us so we can standardize what we're seeing around the state and really give you some good information to help dig into this a bit further. So thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
There are questions for Ken on that. Feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat box for him. Otherwise, I think we'll go ahead and keep the meeting rolling. Next up, we're going to hear from Dr. Terence Robinson, who's going to be giving us an update on precision apple cropland management, particularly looking at this timing pink into bloom. So Terence, we'll go ahead and turn things over to you.
I'd like to focus a lot on the overall concepts of managing cropland in 2024, but I'll give specific suggestions related to the bloom and petal fall timing as we go through this. So let me start with just a quick review of last year and what we think we saw. Bloom was pretty heavy in many blocks last year, and as we went forward, we ran into the frost in May that reduced crop for many people and resulted in russeting of some fruit. And this was a real challenge in the thinning. And so some people backed off, and then in the end, we ended up with heavier crop than we probably should have. Now, as we look forward to what happened through the winter, we had a relatively warm December and January, but in late January, we had a cold snap. I don't think there was any damage from that cold snap. But then in March, we had another cold snap, and there was some damage in Western New York to flower buds that had already got started. So we have to deal with that this year, and people have to really look at their buds. They'll be able to see it more clearly once the buds open. And when the buds open, you're going to want to look for whether the pistil is intact or whether the whole center pistil is dead. And you can cut flowers now and try to figure that out, but it'll be easy to tell once we get into full bloom. So what I've seen so far in Western New York, and I have not been to Eastern New York since pruning demo up there before we got to green tip, but the bloom is generally good. Now, most blocks are good, but some Honeycrisp blocks in Fuji are light, where thinning didn't work well last year. Now, if we look for this year, I want to re-emphasize a couple of concepts that we've taught before, and that is, it's useful to have some sort of a target final fruit number in your mind as you prune and thin. And I give two examples here of how we would calculate the optimum crop load for Honeycrisp and for Gala. Now, this example is a 3 by 12 foot planting at 1,210 trees to the acre. If the target is 1,200 bushels to the acre of 88 count fruit with Honeycrisp, which is a very high yield, that's about 87 fruits per tree. With Gala at a 1,500 bushel, but smaller size at 100 count, that's about 124 fruits per tree. But this is a range I like people to think about. For high density orchards, for Honeycrisp, we're in the 80, 90, 100 fruit range. And for Gala, we're in the 120, 130, 140 fruit range for our final target number of fruits. Now, it's getting a little late, but it's still possible to go out and adjust bud numbers, and it would be useful as you go into the thinning season to kind of know where you're at. For example, with Honeycrisp, if you wanted 87 fruits, we're suggesting you leave 50% extra insurance buds. That would mean you'd be leaving after pruning 131 floral buds. Now, that's a really great target number if you're close to that. But I found that over the last several years, if you leave more than 175 or maybe up to 200 flower clusters on Honeycrisp, you get into real trouble with biennial bearing. So it would be very useful for everybody to kind of get a sense in their Honeycrisp blocks how many flower clusters they're looking at. I would suggest if it's more than 175, you ought to do a little more pruning. With Gala, the number can be a little bit higher. There we want more fruits. So times 1.5, we'd look for around 186 floral buds per tree. But I would say don't leave more than 250, because what happens is what happened last year. Thinning didn't work well enough, and people with a high bud load to start with could not thin Gala down well enough. And there we had excessive crop on Gala for the most part last year. So those are two numbers I want you just to kind of keep in your mind, get an idea in your blocks about how many buds you have on your trees. And if you got way too many, there's still time to do a little touch-up pruning. Now, it's been interesting that we've had very good success a year ago in counting buds with computer vision. And this year, some growers are beginning to count buds with computer vision cameras. And so this, I hope, will become very routine in the next few years, that people will utilize one of the systems that's out there and get a sense of where you are on the number of buds per tree as you go into the thinning season. Now, it's very important to control this total bud number on the tree for three reasons. First, In the springtime, the tree mobilizes reserves both from the root and stored in the trunk of nitrogen, carbohydrates, and cytokinins, and moves them up. And then it distributes them into each of the buds. Now, with an excessive number of buds, each bud receives less than the optimum number level it should. And so you have weak buds. Weak buds have low set, but worse, they produce small fruit size, especially with Gala. But with biennial varieties, particularly Fuji and Honeycrisp, they are more biennial. And then the last reason is that whenever you start a year with a high number of floral buds, you end up, after all your efforts with thinning, with high number of final fruits. And that's what happened to us in 2023 in many, many blocks. And that's why, despite the frost we had on May 18th, we still had a very large crop that's resulted in some challenges in the market. So if you can get a sense of how many buds you have and make sure you're not way above these target numbers I just gave, I think you'll be much more successful in your thinning program this year. Now, I want to focus on bloom thinning now. Now, bloom thinning is controversial still, and we've been pushing it for many years, but it turns out that it's essential for every biennial bearing variety. I'll focus on Honeycrisp, but the same goes for Fuji, for McCowan, or any other biennial bearing variety you're dealing with. And the reason is that each fruit has 10 seeds in it, and those seeds produce a hormone called gibberellin that's called the anti-flowering hormone, and it inhibits flowering for the next year. So if you have a large number of little fruits from bloom all the way till maybe hand thinning, every one of those little fruits has seeds that are producing a lot of gibberellin and inhibiting flower formation for the next year. The sooner you can reduce the number of fruits through thinning, the more likely you are to be able to induce flowering through some of our return bloom sprays. Thus, bloom thinning becomes essential because it allows you to take out some of those seeds at a very early stage. Now, I give two examples at the bottom. I suggested earlier that you prune Honeycrisp to 131 buds if you have a 3x12 planting. And each of those buds has five flowers and then 10 seeds in each little fruitlet. So that works out to about 6,500 seeds on each tree. If you have a heavy bloom and you didn't prune, and we've seen this in many cases where Honeycrisp trees can have 400 initial buds, that bud load is 20,000 seeds, or almost more than three times as many seeds. Now, if you do a really good job thinning and you thin every spur down to a single fruitlet, with the first example, you'd have 1,300 seeds left on the tree, but in the last case, you would have 4,000. Thus, 4,000 seeds producing gibberellin is not possible to overcome that with anything else you do, and you'll end up in biennial bearing with both Honeycrisp and Fuji. So you combine precision pruning with blossom thinning. It's an excellent method to remove excess seeds before they cause too much damage. Now, I would just review this quickly. This is our model or our protocol for precision crop load management, precision thinning. We start estimating how many flowers we have and then spray at bloom time. One of two different approaches I'll talk about in just a minute. And that's followed by a petal fall spray and then a 10 to 13 millimeter spray. And if needed, this rescue spray at 16 to 20. And I have listed in yellow the timing we want for each one of those sprays. So my main message today is we're at Pink in Western New York. It's going to be a cool week, but we'll warm up early next week. And I think we will get into early bloom on some varieties in the first half of next week. Thus, I think it's time to prepare for your blossom thinning program. Now, I say it's essential for Honeycrisp, Fuji, but for a different reason, it's essential for Gala because it allows you to lighten the crop load early and remove many of the flowers on one-year wood that produce small fruit through the bloom thinning process. We typically want to use the pollen tube growth model to time the sprays, and we've suggested now for a couple of years that we should spray in New York a little bit earlier than the model says, at 60% on the model, because what we're spraying typically, if it's a caustic spray, is ATS, ammonium thiosulfate. And it is not as good a thinner as what the West Coast people use of lime sulfur and oil. But we're not allowed, because of label restrictions, to use lime sulfur and oil. Thus, our only option is ATS, and the suggested rate is 2.5 to 3%. Now, if you go over 3%, there's more likelihood of some significant phytotoxicity to the spur leaves. But you may want to consider that based upon what I'll say a little bit later. But right now, I just want you to focus on that 2.5 up to 3%. This typically will burn the stigma of the pistil. There will typically be some mild leaf phytotoxicity, but we've not seen any effect of that on fruit finish. And always requires 2 applications, and in some cases with Gala and protracted bloom on 1-year wood will require 3 applications. Now, a technical point is that it's not registered as a thinner in New York, but you can list on your spray records, it's a bloom time foliar nitrogen thinner. Now, an alternative to ATS are the 2 hormone thinners, basically the NA types. NA, fructose, pomaxa, or refined, is labeled for use at bloom, as well as NAD, amethyst. Both are very safe at bloom. The flip side of that coin is that they're not very effective, but they never cause overthinning, and they can be sprayed safely at the 10 part per million or 4 ounce per 100 tree row volume dilute. But over the years, when we've used NA at bloom, it does help improve return bloom on Honeycrisp and on Fuji. And thus, although sometimes we don't see a tremendous amount of thinning, the NA at that rate is killing some of the seeds in some of the fruits, thus reducing the seed load on the tree and improving return bloom. NAD also has worked very well in this. It's got some resurgence in the last few years and more popular. It can also be sprayed very safely at bloom. The timing for these 2 is not so critical. We would typically spray this when we have essentially 100% of the spur bloom open, but not worrying about the bloom on lateral buds on 1-year wood. Those we hope to take off with this spray. So when you get basically in a spur cluster, almost all the flowers open, 4 out of 5 or 5 out of 5, that's the time to spray NAA or NAD. I've made a couple of suggestions last year, and I'll repeat them here. I don't know if they're that great, but this would be the way I would look at it. So ATS has been shown to be effective in improving return bloom when it works, but it doesn't work all the time. But it seems to not work very well when it's cool or way too cool. But it also is a little bit more dangerous when it's really hot. Now, this year, my view of the forecast and what Jessica just told us, I don't think we're looking at any days in the 80s during the thinning season in May. But if we have temperatures between 70 and 80 during bloom, it's perfect for ATS. And what happens if it's really hot? Bloom happens too fast, and you just can't react to get the first and second spray on in time. But milder temperatures, low 70s, is when you would want to use ATS, because bloom happens in a measured pace over a 1-week period. But I would switch to using NAA or NAD when weather conditions are poor, when there's been some frost, or you have cool weather, poor bee flight, or very hot and bloom is fast, or you just simply not really comfortable with caustic thinners. And that would be my suggestions to those of you considering trying to decide which of those 2 to use. Now, I will add that Mike Basedow is publishing a paper in the next fruit quarter. You won't see it until June, in which in the Champlain Valley, ATS hasn't worked that well for several years that he's done trials, and NAAs tended to work better. And I kind of think that's mostly due to this cool temperatures. So we'll see what we get this year, but I think we may have during the bloom period next week, probably some pretty decent days in the low 70s, which might be conducive to ATS. Now I want to give a little bit of interesting data that what the future holds, and that is we've had some pretty good success last year at counting the number of flower buds on the tree using cameras. In this case, we used Orchard Robotics camera with these varieties, Fuji, Gala, New York 1. And you can see that the relationship is pretty good, meaning that we could go out with these camera systems and do two things at bloom. The first is to run the camera in the morning, run it at noon, run it in the afternoon, and be able to say from the camera data exactly when we should start the pollen tube growth model. Now, as a reminder, we want to start that when we have enough king flowers open to have our target crop number. So with Gala, if we want to, say, 125 apples, when 125 blooms, king blooms are open, that's when we start the model. And instead of having to count trees by hand, you could use a camera system to do that. But maybe the more exciting and what lots of people are talking about nowadays is utilizing this count to create a map of your orchard and then use variable rate spraying for chemical thinning. Now, some people are going to do that this year, as well as us here at the station. This is a picture I borrowed from the ARIA imaging people of an orchard in the Netherlands of Elstar. And you can see the picture on the left is the actual trees, with some trees in heavy bloom and some no bloom. It kind of reminds me of some Honeycrisp orchards we have. With their camera system, they categorize in the right-hand column each tree, whether it is red, meaning heavy bloom, yellow, medium bloom, or green, no bloom. And then they put that map into a sprayer, computer-guided sprayer, to spray variably down the row. And this is their image from their website showing that the farmer would first scan the orchard with the camera, and then you process that data and create a prescription map, load that map into the computer that runs the sprayer, and then drive the rows with the sprayer turning on and off, depending on the bloom load. Now, for a very uniformly blooming variety, an orchard, it might not be that big a deal, but for variable blooming Honeycrisp, this might really be great. So stay tuned, and we'll talk about how this is working out next year or in the summer tour. Now, I want to sort of try to wrap it up by give you my suggestions for how I would suggest you approach Honeycrisp this year. Bloom, I still suggest an ATS spray between 2.5% and 3%. If it's cool, you might go up to 3.5%, but I would not go above 3.5% because of too much phytotoxicity. But if it's really cool, I probably would just spray NA instead of ATS. Then at petal fall, I would come back with the regular NAA, a full dose of 4 ounces or 10 parts per million plus carbaryl, but waiting until the fruits are 5 to 6 millimeters. Now, we hopefully will have other fruit thinning talks around that petal fall time, and we'll remind you about this aspect of it. And later, when we have the meetings at the 10, 11 millimeters, we'll talk about those sprays. And then finally, what to do if nothing works, and spraying again at 16 to 20 millimeters. Now, you'll see here in that case, I've listed Exceed and Maxell as an option. And I'll talk about that at the very end when I talk about thinking about return bloom already at this point as we go into the bloom season. For Gala, a little bit different. I like Promelin in early king bloom to improve typiness, and then at full bloom, ATS. Except if it's cool or it's really hot, then probably NAA. But at petal fall, typically we would put on NAA plus carbaryl, but last year we had great success combining Maxell and Exceed at petal fall. It's the only thing that worked. Maxell and 7 didn't work, NA and 7 didn't work, but Maxell and Exceed worked, probably because Exceed creates some ethylene in the plant. And so that's something that I want you to think about if we get into the situation that we were in last year, and that is this. This is a carbohydrate balance from last year showing where the black line is where is a petal fall. And we had no deficit to help us. And then it got worse by the time we got to the 10 millimeter. And so Maxell and 7 with a surplus of carbohydrates is a weak thinner. and it didn't really work at petal fall, worked, modestly at the 12 millimeter. And so we ended up with way too many Gala and many orchards. But the one thing that did work at petal fall under these conditions of a surplus was Exceed and Maxell. And so I'm going to throw that out as an option if we get into this situation this year of a surplus. Now, I'm going to pause right here and say I'll have to wait and see how it all pans out, but this is what I expect we're going to see again. I don't see any temperatures in the 80s that would give us deficits. Temperatures in the high 60s and 70s through the thinning period, which I think will give us mild thinning. We may need that combination of Maxell and Exceed to get the job done on Gala. Now, I want to also comment briefly about just how important the fruit growth rate model is. I think you've got to use it. I know it's time consuming and tedious to measure 375 fruits twice between each spray using a caliper. We have some solutions sort of on the way. The best, I think, is the cell phone system of Pomera, but they have withdrawn from the market in 2024 to try to consolidate their plans, I guess, and they're not allowing anybody to use their system in 2024. So an option would be to use Todd Einhorn's system of picking 200 fruits and weighing them and using a modified model called the fruit size distribution model. And number 3 is a pie in the sky a little further out. But I wanted to show the Pomera and why I really like it. This is data over 3 years from not only New York, but Michigan, Massachusetts, and North Carolina, showing how well the Pomera system with a cell phone camera predicted final fruit set compared to the blue dots, which was us measuring with a caliper and using the fruit growth rate model developed by Dwayne Green. So the Pomera system was very close to the Malusim model that Dwayne Green developed for a fruit growth rate model. And so I think if that system continues in the future, it will be probably the preferred way of figuring out how well your bloom and petal fall sprays worked before you spray the 10 millimeter spray. So I'll just skip that results from last year. I want to end with this just to get you on board with what we're trying to do for return bloom. So Pollyanna showed that Honeycrisp has its flower initiation much earlier than other varieties. Thus, when we have sprayed NAA or Ethereal in the past, near the end of June, we've been too late to influence floral initiation for the next year. So we propose now for a couple of years a much earlier timing of return bloom spray, starting at 16 millimeters, spraying Ethereal every 10 days. And as long as the rate's not too high and the temperature's not too high, that Ethereal should not cause any thinning, but there's always a risk of that. But by starting early with Ethereal, we can influence flower bud initiation on this difficult variety. This is data from a couple of years showing, you don't really need to read it all, but the green bar and the yellow bar were Ethifon sprayed starting at 16 millimeters and then 4 sprays every 10 days. All the other bars compared to the red control were not that great, whether we sprayed Ethifon in June, NAA in June, even NAA early was not as good as Ethifon or ACC. Thus, it seems like being able to get some ethylene into that plant, whether it's by Ethereal or through ACC starting early, is key to getting flower bud differentiation. Now, the Valent people have it on their label that you can spray Exceed for this 16 millimeter or 20 millimeters timing, but it's really not, they're really not suggesting that we spray it later. So one of the possible approaches is this, and this is where I'll end. I suggest you start this year on Honeycrisp with 280 TSs. If the conditions are cool, just use a single NAA spray at bloom. At petal fall, come in with an NAA in 7, quite high rate, 7.5 to 10 parts. At the normal 10 millimeter, when we get the maximum thinning efficacy, 7.5 parts is what works well for mature Honeycrisp. But once we're out of the thinning window, we're in the 16, 17 millimeters, then you start these 4 sprays of Ethereal. The first one is at a half dose or half pint to the acre. or you could use Exceed at a half rate. And then follow it up every 10 days with another pint of ethyl. Just throw it in the tank when you're spraying your regular fungicide and insecticide all the way. This will take you all the way up into early July. Don't spray ethyl much past the 4th of July. You know, there's a little bit of days you wiggle room there, but that's kind of a cutoff for the end of the ethyl applications. So that's what we want you to kind of have in your mind. And with that, I'm going to skip that, not that important, and just end our presentation and be happy to give answers or opinions on any questions you might have. So Mike, I'll turn it back to you.
All right, thank you very much, Terence, for a great presentation. If folks have questions for Terence, please go ahead and put those into the chat box. And Terence, just to kick things off, I can ask, you mentioned 2 applications of ATS on Honeycrisp. Do you generally stick with 2 applications, or have you ever gone to 3 on other varieties like Gala, or how do you make that determination?
It's an excellent question. I make that determination based on whether there's bloom on 1-year wood. Honeycrisp rarely has bloom on 1-year wood, and so 2 applications tends to work great. But with Gala, you have bloom opening up so late that you need that 3rd application. So any variety where you have bloom on 1-year wood probably is going to take 3 applications.
All right, great, thank you. We have a question from Joel in the chat. Do you expect any thinning to happen when you're starting your ethyl at 16 millimeters?
Yes, if the temperatures are above 80 degrees. But that's the reason why that first ethyl spray is a half rate. And a half rate really will not give any thinning when fruits are 16, 17, 18 millimeters. If the temperatures are, you know, mid 70s, high 70s, but when it gets to 85 to 90, then I wouldn't hesitate myself putting it on at that timing.
Okay, thank you. I guess to ask the same question for Exceed at that time, and would you expect to see some thinning if you were using Exceed on its own?
Well, that's the beautiful thing about Exceed. Now, just to get a small bit into the biochemistry, ethyl or ethifon, when you put it on, it's immediately converted to ethylene. So you're dealing with a massive dose of ethylene right off the bat, and it has all the negative consequences of ethylene. But Exceed has to go through an enzymatic step in the plant to convert it from ACC to ethylene, and that is a rate-controlled step. And so it does not have the high temperature risk that ethyl does. Ethyl is very risky above 85 degrees. Exceed is not. So if I had those conditions, I'd put Exceed on as that. Probably keep the rate down to maybe the half rate. We use normally for Exceed, use 400 parts per million. So I'd use 200, 300. But you don't have the risk that you do with ethyl.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Chris on Fuji. Will using NAA at bloom and Maxell at 12 millimeters cause pygmy fruit?
It's possible, and that's one of the risks. And so it would be much preferable just to stick with ATS on Fuji because of the potential pygmy problem. Now, the issue is really how long distance between the NAA and the Maxell. If it's more than 10 days, I don't see much response to pygmy. But if your NAA goes on Fuji at petal fall and a week later you put Maxell on, you get pygmy fruit. And so that's why over the years we said with Fuji, use a strictly Maxell-based program. And that means also the bloom spray should not be an NAA, should be an ATS.
Okay, and to follow up on that, would Amethyst kind of follow those same guidelines, or?
Yes,
Okay.
it would follow the same guidelines.
Okay, great, thank you. And we have a question from Jim. Did the poor seed survival in 23 contribute to more flower buds for this year from what you've been seeing?
Absolutely. I think we lost some seeds in that frost. And that's one of the reasons why we've got a relatively beautiful bloom, even though the crop was pretty heavy in general.
Sure.
I come back to this, it's all seed number, and you can have years where you have 10 seeds in every fruit and other years where you have only 4 in every fruit. And those are big differences in the seed load for the gibberellin production in that plant.
All right, thank you. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions. If you do still have more, please go ahead and type those into the chat box. But I think I'll go ahead and turn things over to Janet to introduce our next speakers. Thanks again.
All right. Great, thanks, Mike. So our next speaker is Dr. Monique Rivera. She's the tree fruit entomologist. I can't call her new anymore. She's been here for a couple of years, so she's going to be talking about sort of your pink insecticides and petal fall and what to look forward to coming up early this season.
Okay, looks good, right?
It's good, yep. All right,
Okay.
good night.
Let's hop right into it. So I have a bunch of things to talk about here at Pink: San Jose scale, OBLR, rosy apple aphid, tarnished plant bug, talking about mating disruption for the LEPs, which the timing is right to get that out, and our 2024 bonus insect at Pink, woolly apple aphid. So yeah, it's been a weird year and it probably will continue to be weird. Then I'm just going to give you a brief, if you're not already listening to scaffolds, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of some changes that have been made. Okay, so San Jose scale. So when it comes to this particular insect, our real goal here is to prevent the establishment of the sessile armored stage, which is this weird looking like shell thing here. And there's really 3 key points for interrupting this life cycle to get the best control. So we want to try to get contact with this insect at their dormant stage. And so this will help eliminate the population as they are fully inactive and not moving. The target here is the immature crawler stage. And so these are mostly exposed, they're not great flyers, and this is the best timing for insecticide efficacy. And the development of the populations is dependent on mating. So you have a rapid population establishment. Each female can lay 200 to 400 young. So this can escalate quick. So timing is everything, like with most insect pests and diseases. So what we want to do is detect this first emergence of crawlers. So the idea here is to scout areas, especially that have had previous scale infestation, or you see that sessile stage, and you can use black electrical tape around an infested tree limb, which usually happens early to mid-June, but I bet you we're bumped up. So I would just go ahead and start thinking about timing this at least 2 weeks earlier than that mid-June timing. There's also a sex pheromone trap for males that you could be hanging approximately now to try to track them as well. So you can monitor this tape for 2 times a week. This will help dial in your timing and using a 10x hand lens to be able to see those really tiny crawlers. I do want to talk a little bit, just mention that there is mating disruption being developed for this. I talk more about that on this week's scaffolds, which will be released tomorrow with Dr. Juliana Wilson from Michigan State, who has worked with this tool. So let's talk treatment options. Typically, we recommend a dormant spray with oil at 2% when you have the black cap dominant dormant stage. And this can be combined for use against rosy apple aphid. You can also add a steam to this for enhanced control. And the goal is really to get total coverage on the woody material. So making sure to get this on before you have full leaf out. I know oil can be complicated to work with Captan. So there are some other options. So Movento cannot be applied before petal fall. I'll be saying that a couple times throughout this talk, but that's definitely something that you could apply later in the season if you still have an explosion of them. Savanto is a soft material. I'm not sure if that can be applied pre-petal fall, so you'll have to read the label. But typically our IGRs, our insect growth regulators, Esteem and Centaur, are critical for managing this pest. So let's get into OBLR. So typically when it comes to scouting for these guys, you're examining bud clusters for 3% larval infestation. So that means pretty much if you're finding them, it's time to treat. So the treatment suggestions there are in particular the BT products, so Dipel, Agree, and Javelin, and there's a couple others out there too. Rosy apple aphid, so the scouting protocol for this is to examine clusters or terminal leaves for wingless adults and nymphs. And then if you find one infested cluster, these are so quick moving that it is suggested to go ahead and treat. And this can occur later in the season as well. So the treatment suggestions, again, that multi-use dormant oil, complicated to use if you're using Captan, but if you are not, you've moved that out of your program, then this is certainly a time to target when we have less leaves on the tree. And then again, Savanto and Assail. Movento, this again, after petal fall for that use. So let's talk tarnished plant bug. This is a complicated one. If you have it, it's really frustrating and can cause a lot of damage. It feeds on buds and flower parts in the spring and can possibly cause aborted fruit. And they also have 2 to 3 generations per year. So that also creates a dynamic that you have to sort of keep on top of. They are active in the early season on warmer days. So our coming up 70s days would be days where you might find them if you were sweep knitting row middles. And so for monitoring, I don't think many people are monitoring for them, but just kind of checking to see if they're finding them. We recommend a white sticky panel trap along the border, set at typically at silver tips or a little bit behind the 8 ball there, but putting 1 trap every 3 to 5 acres. I highly doubt that people are going to do that, but that is the current running suggestion. And then you're supposed to take these cumulative trap actions and use action threshold. So 3 tarnished plant bugs averaged over 5 is a conservative action threshold to use up until bloom if there's a history of outbreak. But if you're getting 5 to 8 tarnished plant bugs per 5 traps, this is considered a high population, and this should be targeted. Generally, this is happening more so in the post-bloom phase. So unfortunately, the best tool for these guys are pyrethroids. They really will kill off your natural enemies. And it can also flare European red mite. So use with caution for these guys. I think the ultimate control for these insects is to really get at those broadleaf weeds and the row middles. These are the alternate hosts. This is what's keeping them there. If you can do really good herbicide management, I think this is the best recommendation we have, because using those pyrethroids at that point in the season, you're really going to knock back any natural enemies you do have. So let's talk OFM and codling moth mating disruption. So now is the time to hang ties if you're thinking about this. OFM is generally ahead of bloom and CM is generally at petal fall, though we just caught our first codling moth here at AgriTech, so that's become interesting. I think the technology overall is becoming easier to use, and I think that it's very convenient that they're starting to combine different pests. I know there is some interest in doing OFM, CM, and San Jose scale, so we'll see if that ever happens. I think one of the critical things is that this, with all of the labor issues in the industry, less dispensers per acre equals less time spent out there applying them. So that CM, OFM, meso, you can get 32 to 38 dispensers per acre, which is quite low. And this is really a technique best for larger blocks, 10 plus acres with lower infestations. We still have a ton of questions to answer about this. For example, what does the spray program look like while you're initiating this, and dispersal of the pheromone under varying conditions. So now we're going to get into our bonus pest, which is woolly apple aphid, the bane of everyone's existence from last year and this year. And really our goal is to get this early detection of aphids. If you're scouting for these guys, look in areas with previous infestation from the year before. Check perimeter trees, young trees, in particular Fujis seem to be very attractive to them. So we've had a mild winter. If you haven't already been looking for them, please go out and look for them. You may just find them. And one of the things that we want to try our best to conserve, I have chatted with a couple people who have said in certain organic blocks, they're able to knock them back with this biological control. I know in conventional, which is most of our acreage, we really do not have a ton of these guys. They're there, but they're not enough to control. So this is Aphelinus mali, and that's the parasitoid of woolly apple aphid. So the photo on the bottom with the holes inside those carcasses, those are woolly apple aphids that have been parasitized. So these guys overgrown, they overwinter as full-grown larvae or pupa inside of the dead woolly apple aphids. And so we typically see them diapause from October to March. When I first found our active colonies in Western New York, it was the last week of March. This came as a major shock. So if you haven't already been out there looking, please do. You're really looking for, with these guys, looking for woolly apple aphid mummies with the circular exit holes. So that's evidence that they've been here, but you're not necessarily going to see the wasp. In 2023, we did look at thousands of colonies from a single site, and there was a very, very low population. So clearly something else in our program that we're doing is knocking them back and not allowing them to feed well off of the woolly apple aphid. So let's get into insecticide treatments for these guys. So our Lassa chlorpyrifos, I do think, has played a major role in the resurgence of this pest. There's not one really great, strong treatment for multiple pests anymore. I've been emphasizing dormant oil applications, even though I know this is complicated and the weather is a threat. I still think it's a useful tool that is low risk overall if you're able to manage the other things that make it risky. So spray coverage is key to management with insecticides generally. So driving 2.5 miles per hour or less, and water volume can depend on tree size and density. So the larger the tree, the more water volume you're going to need. And if your tree density, like say they're very bushy, you're going to need more water to actually make contact to the interior of the canopy, which is where you typically find the woolly colonies. Proper tree pruning can be essential on low density and large tree plantings as well, just to open up and bring the sun to the interior of the canopy will help them not prefer to establish there. So like I mentioned before, I really think biocontrol can be a great supplement to the chemical control. We haven't really figured out what's holding them back in terms of treatment options, but we think that with some further work, we could potentially nail down some of those details. But our newer, softer chemistry, they do help to control or sustain these biocontrol agents. But at the same time, the more narrow spectrum, the more timing matters. So it's important to sort of consider that as you're moving towards the more narrow spectrum. It's really timing is everything. So let's get into the true treatment options for these guys. And just a reminder to read the label before application. There can be some other details that are not represented here. So Movento and Senstar are two group 23 insecticides that are considered the soft gold standard for this pest. So this is applied after petal fall. We're typically expecting them after petal fall, but not this year. So I don't have data on this, but there is some data floating around the industry on Admire Pro and generics using them foliarly, which can cause them to resorb into the plant and be systemic. However, at this time, we're pretty close to bloom, so I would not choose that. There's also some evidence that possibly applying this to the soil could be good for large infestations, but it's with caution. Soil type with more clay can cause less uptake, and you're kind of wasting the chemistry and potentially getting it into the tree at a lower than active dose, which can cause resistance to build to that product. Another good option, I have not worked with this in apples, but I have worked with it before, abamectin. It's a neurotoxin that's derived from a soil bacterium, and it has good overall aphid activity. I think that last year all the buzz in Western New York was Safina, and it is labeled for woolly apple aphid suppression. That's what we're recommending for this early season. When you can get max contact. Right now, when we don't have a ton of leaves, you can run at 50 gallons per acre. You're going to get good coverage on the woody material. So it's unclear how available diazinon is going to be here in 2024. If you have some of it, again, this is best to like save as your last ditch effort. You've got a massive infestation. It's gone out of control. For large and established populations, that's how I would recommend this. It can be detrimental to beneficials, but it really is just a blip, and you will see good control. This is also a good material if you're targeting San Jose scale as well. So this is a little bit of a look at an orchard that we worked in last year. So these are Fuji's. See how bushy that canopy is? That is really when you want to up your water volume. So when you get to that part of the season where your trees are fully leafed out and they've put on that additional growth, this is the time to up the water volume. Right now, we can get away with less. When we are assessing these guys, we collect them and look at them under the microscope like this for dead and alive activity. I think it's important to note that when the infestations get really bad, you have multiple layers of these insects, one over the other, which causes, you might see an initial knockdown of the population, but it will resurge if you're not getting good control and become worse. So just a note about that and a warning for this season where this is prevalent. I want to take this opportunity too to quickly review systemic and translaminar activity in insecticides. So systemic activity is when the product is absorbed by the plant and distributed throughout its tissues. A lot of aphid products work this way because aphids find little nooks and crannies to feed in. And this is really an effective method for pests that feed on the sap or the tissues of the plant. So aphids in this case, and typically it can be applied on the soil or foliar. I think, again, be careful, make sure your soil type is right for this type of treatment on the soil. But some examples are imidacloprid, that's considered the gold standard for systemics, and then spirotetramat, which is Movento and Senstar. And one of the reasons why Movento and Senstar are very popular and very well liked is because they don't become the active ingredient until they are digested by the plant into the active. So it's very, very soft on beneficials. And so you will see in areas like Washington State where they have a lot less disease and they're spraying a lot less, they will really tend to prefer the Movento because they want to sustain those natural enemy populations. So there is another type of activity where the insecticide is getting into the plant. So that's called translaminar activity. And what's happening is you're spraying it on the surface of the plant, the green leaf material, and it's able to penetrate through the cuticle of the leaf and penetrate into the tissue to absorb there and stay there for a while. So examples would be ivermectin or safina in this case, both of which have some contact activity as well. So what may be a worthwhile program to try based on this information? So if you can do the oil, do the oil. I think that would help. But if you've got wool already, there's no telling how well that's going to work. And right now what I'm hearing is that there is wool already in the aerial colonies. Movento at post-petal fall or imidacloprid applied when shoots are still growing. So this is all post-petal fall stuff. There should be more data from my lab coming on residuality and more information to come on ground-up applications of imidacloprid if we're funded. So right now, my key recommendation for this early in the season is to try out safina. This appears to be a good contact product. We played with it a little bit last year, but I do think the jury is out on adjuvants, what works best in timing. So as part of the timing, I think this is one of the best products that we have for right now. But the recommendations need further refinement. So I think this is nice because it's on the cheaper side at about $40 to $43 per acre at a 7-ounce rate with a pre-harvest interval of 7 days. So late in the season, it could be, you could potentially strategically use this as well. I think more than a lot of other pests, well, all the pests, this matters, but in particular for woolly apple aphid, I really think it's critical to rotate your chemistries. They potentially have only asexual reproduction on apple, meaning that if there happens to be a resistance gene in the population, it will proliferate really quickly. So being really careful to rotate with them and make sure you're not reusing or overusing one particular product. So what's next? We're running some trials for woolies addressing water volume. I'd like to be able to show that the water volume matters rather than just saying it, because I do know it's a pain in the butt. Addressing application timing. So understanding what this looks like if you put, let's say, Movento ahead of safina or safina in front of Movento, and then assessing a ground application of imidacloprid for control. I also want to mention I'm all in with Reality Research. They are insecticide research professionals, and I'm hoping to bring my entomology expertise so that we can get top-notch data. So let's move on to scaffolds. What are we doing? Essentially, we're in year 2 of real-time updates. Every week on Tuesday, we're aiming to release one podcast that is generally pretty quick. Last week's episode is only 23 minutes. And we're communicating insect and disease and other management stuff in real time. So this is meant to replace the Scaffolds newsletter, a new format. I think it's faster to deliver and get it out to folks. So we're on pretty much everything that you can find podcasts on. If you have any sort of podcast app and you search Scaffolds, you should be able to find us. We do have a new logo this year, which is featured there on the right-hand side. Also wanted to mention that Google Podcasts no longer is existing if it isn't already deleted, and they're porting all their podcasts over to YouTube Music. So if you were using Google Podcasts to listen, switch over to YouTube Music. Most of our listeners are listening on Spotify. I don't know if that's a help. That's another app. But I wanted to end with this. This is, you can go ahead and scan this. This will bring you to the overall page where you can listen, and it's not necessarily associated with an app. So you can just bookmark it. And with that, I can take any questions.
Great. Thank you, Monique. If anybody has any questions, feel free to go ahead and stick those in the chat. I saw one came in already. Question, Monique, about, I know you mentioned that you're planning some research on the ground application of imidacloprid, wondering if there's any info about trunk spray or that mixed with the ground application.
So I have had a lot of questions about trunk sprays, but because we're already finding aerial colonies, unless you're sure that you do not have them in your aerial trees, I don't think now's the time for trunk and ground. I think that because we're already finding active colonies, you should shoot for covering the entire tree at this point.
Great. I think maybe another question popped up. Oh, nope, that was the same one. I did have a question for you. In terms of the Surfina, is there any information yet about impact on beneficials, specifically thinking pollinators and or like the parasitoids that might be helping you with your woolly apple control?
Not that I know of. I
Okay.
know that it's
I
in
haven't one.
a 9D class. So it is among the softer insecticides, but with that translaminar activity going pre-bloom, we don't have a lot of other options, and a lot of people are going to be turned off by the oil. So until we have more information and more data, I don't think we can recommend too much else. There's not
Oh,
too
yeah,
many.
for sure. I was just curious if there was any data about that yet. And there was also a question about European apple softfly. Is this a good time to be scouting for that? Should we be waiting? Do you have any thoughts about softfly?
I think that what's complicated here is that all the phenologies of the pest are going to be bumped up by at least 2 weeks, it seems like. And so I think that everyone should be looking for anything that they've had a problem with, especially if you previously last year found infestations, you should absolutely be looking for it now. I mean, I think I think this is, most people know this, but just to restate, the insects need those thermal units to develop, just like the tree needs that for phenology. So because we've had more, they're going to come out earlier. It's just going to be a monster year for most of the insects.
Right. Well, it looks like that's all the questions for now. You're going to be on till the end, right, Monique?
Yes.
So if there's any other questions, stick those in the chat and Monique will answer them also in the chat. Thank you very much. And we are now going to turn over to our last talk of the day. That is Dr. Kerik Cox, who will suddenly appear there. He is. So this is the tree fruit pathologist down in Geneva at Cornell AgriTech, and he's going to be talking about some of the bloom and petal fall disease thoughts that he might have.
Yep, just going to be some quick updates on the season for the two major pathogens, scab and fire blight. We'll get into some of the others later on. Let's see. Let's make this big. All right, let's swap the slides so you can actually see it. I think you can see this a lot better now.
Perfect. Thank you.
Pictures out of the way. All right, let's see what's happening. It's not a big update, but just a little bit of things. So what's it looking like? Really mild winter early on for warm weather and mid-February to mid-March. Many warm days, many warmer days than the type of weather that we're having now. It almost seems colder now than it did when I went to the Eastern New York meeting, strangely enough. And then somewhere along the line, green tips showed up between late March and early April. Still a lot of cold days, a lot of hard freezes. I think the newest system is having a lot of trouble predicting green tip because it was accumulating a lot of degree days in the February and the January period, which may have caused those models to artificially predict green tip earlier than the times that you actually see them. Computers are really good at implementing degree days. Trees, it takes a little more time for them to use. And sometimes it seems that in the Hudson Valley and some of the others and some of the Finger Lakes area, we were getting green tip about almost 10 days plus more than what the newer models were predicting. So it makes the predictions a little interesting this year, but when you do a prediction, use your green tip. Don't do what the model thinks your green tip is doing. So low snow cover, we got a lot of heavy rains from silver tip to half-inch green is now, and now as we're even moving into tight cluster and pink, and making the whole situation very confusing and challenging. I don't know about you, but before this meeting, I was spraying, and it was very hard to walk in a lot of the orchards with all the rain. Looks like across the whole area in Western New York, we're looking at a couple of different infection events, some maybe two big ones that come up with a lot of ejections. So far, we've had some things on 4.2, 4.9, and depending on where you were with green tip, these might have really been a lot or very little. and they could have been anywhere from 1%, 11%, or 20%. It looks like we have another one coming up towards tomorrow. Yep, it just all seems like Sunday to me still. All right, so another one is coming up. Depending on where you are, it could be 10 to 15%. Lots of rain, really lots of early rain, really cool. Sometimes it is too cool for apple scab, sometimes it's not. When it starts to get into the 40s, it doesn't like that. It really likes that 55 with a lot of rain and overcast weather. So it's still, I think apple scab is out there and it's happening. Let's take a look at some of the predictions this year for the last infection event, that sort of big one that we just came off with last week. And now this is fairly interesting. And you can see how this changes as the green tip date is fiddled with. So this is sort of the Finger Lakes region here, looking at the big infection event we just came off of. And if I were to leave the green tip at March 14th, which sounds absurd, but that's what NUA predicts. I'm pretty sure my green tip wasn't on March 14th. But anyway, leaving it there gives you a picture that you're about 33% into the season on your ascospore maturity, and you get this massive ejection event. Don't forget, when you look at these things thinking, well, there's 10%, but this is a combined period, and I wish it had added up all of these little percents for me. So that's really looking close to about 20% ejection, which actually puts it into a scary period for that thing. Now, the picture changes a little bit depending on when your real green tip does, and you'll see these things change. The infection summary will be the same. Yes, it still rained and you got a lot of leaf wetness, and this is great weather for apple scab. But what happens if I just say, well, you know what, I'm going to move my green tip. I think 321 was a little bit better. Even that still seems a little early for the Finger Lakes for me. But you can see immediately, like, whoa, okay, in this case, you're down to 24%. And it's not so much a 20 event, it's more like a 15 or moderate one. So it makes things very interesting, particularly with the start of the season. What is apple scab thinking? Who knows what it's actually doing and how it responds to this wild changes in weather. I guess we're going to find out. But the good thing is to make sure your trees are protected. And as things begin to creep over the 10%, it's probably time to pay attention to make sure something's going on. In this case, I still would have sprayed it fairly robustly with some good materials, given a 8 plus 3 plus 4, another 15%. It sort of puts it into my threshold of 15%, which is the scary period for using bigger materials. Now, the NUA is stuck at thresholds of 10% and 20. I don't necessarily recommend those, but it could be months before or years before we're able to change them. What does it look like in the Wayne County? You can kind of see the same thing starting to happen in that over this last period, a big chunky one. Oh my gosh, it's 23% or something like that. Change the green tip date and what? Oh, I don't even have a risk anymore. Or you do. It's still, if you add all of these up over the time, you're getting a huge percentage of things popping out. 9, 12, all of these things are starting to happen. It's like 16, 17, getting it into the 15 is sort of my high risk character. So watch the models and how they're using the predictions. Make sure you pick your green tip date. But even if you do pick a later one, be cognizant of these sort of really good weather, 49, 53, a lot of rain, and making sure things are well protected. If you look at the Niagara region, it tells a very terrifying picture. A lot of ejection if you pick a really early green tip date. If you just like, I'm just going to let NUA do whatever. But maybe don't do that. And if you pick your own, even if I move it ahead 7 days, things look radically different. Still a lot of ejection and a lot of rain. You still want to make sure to protect against these. And as we get towards the end of the season, into petal fall and stuff like that, I definitely will encourage you to move that green tip date further into the season. Even if it was on the 20th, move it up to like April 1st. We don't want these simulations to end too soon. So it feels like green tip is a moving target. The sad part about it is ascospore maturity is a moving target. If you actually look at the line that predicts this 30%, for example, there's often plus or minus 40 to 45%, meaning there's a lot of error already built in to the observations of the system. So in that case, I don't feel as odd moving the green tip dates around, if you will. And so I think that's what we're coming off of this week. And we've got a new one coming up. At least it's going to be cold and it doesn't look like as much rain You may or may not have a day or two to put the next level of protectant on. I don't think this week's infection period is going to mandate the best and fanciest single site fungicides. I still say go at it with your best protectant materials and then save those other materials, other single site fungicides for later in the season. We'll talk more about that at the petal fall meeting. Okay, where we are with fire blight. Once again, March cold, April short bursts of really hot weather followed by rain, not much. It seems that most people who would be in really solid bloom would be in Eastern New York or Long Island. Everywhere else is probably in perpetual pink or could be going. It's going to be really, in 2021 and 2022, we had these really cold bloom periods with a really hot, warm, and dry petal fall. Particularly in 2022, we got these really nasty shoot blight epidemics right at petal fall, right in the thinning period, despite a lot of dry weather. And it's always important to note that you can get a lot of dew from humidity, canopy, and water. This year, we've got plenty of water. But as we move into bloom, it could dry up again, but be cognizant of the other humidity situations that you might have. This is typically what we've seen over the last 3 years, with the exception of 2023 that I'll talk about briefly. Maybe some little blip of hot weather at bloom and then really hot stuff right around petal fall, causing me to think, oh, you better don't waste all your good strep here at the early part. You know, really save your best antibiotics and materials to sort of finish strong, as these late season infections, when it gets really hot, can be quite devastating. This is typically what it looked like. This is the 2022 year. We had a lot of problems, and this is right at petal fall. You can see some really awful days in there, even when it's dry. Even the water from your spray and the water from dew and humidity on the ground, as I've learned from my colleagues in Washington State, can cause nasty epidemics. What did it look like in 2023? It was kind of a weird year. I had to do some model finagling to make this whole picture show up. And particularly in our region, more focused around the Finger Lakes, we had a pretty hefty hot period right before bloom. We're not really seeing that this week, and we probably won't see that. And it got hot enough to probably make people want to apply some antibiotics. There's a little blip there in the middle. And then we had a really cold petal fall, and our big hot burst came later in the, a little bit later after petal fall. And I think this contributed to a fairly successful fire blight season for most of New York last year. This last little blip of cool weather right at petal fall and this sort of really prolonged bloom of cold weather allowed people to get a foothold and really knock the inoculum levels down, such that when this thing came along, most people had it under control. The only thing I've noticed is that I thought I could be slick and plant late in the summer, and I got fire blight in September and some really awful heat waves. So be careful if you have some late plantings. And no matter how much you think you've sprayed them through their bloom in August, be careful. They can die quickly. What's it look like now? If we're just going to go ahead and put pink out here early on, I had to fiddle with the model a little bit, but you can kind of see that even if you were in pink on 4/13, which is kind of a crazy date to pick, right here, even if we put it up there, you can kind of see that it's going to be really low fire blight weather through into the weekend. Even if things increase a little bit, you can kind of see that this is typically what everywhere looks like in Western New York and Eastern New York and the Lake Champlain area. We're talking really low TRV values. When this thing gets 1200, it hits extreme. We're in the marginal level of risk prediction. So even if you were to go into bloom, I'd save my best materials for later. You're looking at zeros for your EIP, and you'd be like, oh, why do I have a 0 and a moderate level of infection? Well, this model is a little strange. It doesn't just use heat units. As much as we love the EIP model and the magic number 100, it's going to call it moderate when the average daily temperature exceeds 50. And so it'll flip you into moderate risk, even if you don't have any heat unit accumulation. That being said, you can get some really hot days, and if the temperature falls back down, even if you're over 100, it could take a high and drop it back to a moderate level. So it does take a lot of other things into play. If you get a big temperature cooling at night, it will drop the risk down. If you get an average hot daily temperature, it'll bring your risk back up into the area. The Cougar Blight is literally just counting heat units, and it's now moving on a daily thing. So all of this silliness about little asterisks. There's no 4-day anymore. It's all live, and we're using the newest logic that comes out of Washington. So it's cool this week and into the weekend. There's some hot days coming up, and I think all the stuff that I put out for scaffolds and other things on my blog will give you an idea of what to expect for the weekend. Even if you were at bloom magically, or you had some really early flowering cultivar, I wouldn't even think you'd need to really worry at this point. If you're in the conventional, when the bloom finally does come, strep is still good unless you've been told you have widespread streptomycin resistance. If you do Cassumin, don't forget to put that out in the evening only. The populations of fire blight bacteria increase on the surface during the night, and also this seems to really break down in light. If you've ever gotten one of those bottles of antibiotics from the doctor that's a liquid for your child, it'll be in some kind of coated, opaque container, and they tell you to keep it in the refrigerator. Think of your Cassumin as that antibiotic. You want to give it to your trees at night before they go to bed, and don't get any sun exposure. This will work quite great if you're in the organic world, Blossom Protect, with or without different fungicides, and you should be quite good for the, if you really were into bloom, or you come into bloom soon, if that's your better option. Pink, you could go ahead and do this. It's pretty cold. Trees probably aren't going to respond to these sorts of things. If you want to get them ready for the future of infections, get those pedestal cell walls thick enough so that the bacteria can't invade and move into your flower clusters. I'd say you probably have to go with a full 6 ounces per 100 given the cold, and probably the sun will go away. Or if you want to try the 1-2 punch, which also works really well, according to my studies, and George's out of Michigan State, it's 2 ounces per 100 perhexadiol calcium with an ounce of Actigard. This is particularly good on young trees. The perhexadiol calcium will still do a little bit of pedestal thickening to avoid evasion, and the both of them together turn on more defense genes than either of them alone. You might need higher rates in cloudier weather because you're really sort of playing with plant growth regulators. And that's it. I'll stop sharing the screen.
Okay, great. Thank you. Any questions for Kerik? Feel free to stick those in the chat.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to Mike and Janet.
We'll just go ahead and wrap it up. And I want to say thank you to all the speakers for showing up today and providing us with a lot of information.